Well, welcome to the CHEK blog, everybody. It's been a long time since we've had a new video, but I'm excited. I'm excited to have today's guest. He's new to the CHEK blog, but I think what you'll learn from Matt Sorenson today is kind of a new perspective and a new depth about what holistic health is all about. In particular, as you know, at the CHEK Institute, holistic health is our focus. But sometimes elaborating on what that means can get a little murky. So I wanted to invite Matt on today to talk about a specific modality that he works with called visceral manipulation and how that fits into the holistic model. So this is going to be great. So thanks, Matt, and welcome. I'm supposed to say that Matt, in addition to being an expert at visceral manipulation, is also a very nice guy. And from everything that I've heard, this is true.
Every instinct is telling me to zip right now. So, yeah. Thank you, James.
You're welcome. That's going to make for a very short interview, though. So, so why don't you just start off by telling us, or telling me, what is visceral manipulation?
So, visceral manipulation is the mobilization of the soft tissue that surrounds the organ. So, we all have organs, obviously. And each of those organs are typically surrounded in a layer of fascia, but they also articulate with one another. So, for example, the stomach slides inferior to the liver, and they both slide inferior to the diaphragm. So if there is an adhesion between, say, stomach and liver, stomach and diaphragm, as an example, those restrictions can create functional compensations, which eventually lead to structural compensations. So the modality itself was brought into the therapy world by Jean-Pierre Barral, who's a French osteopath. And he first came across the concept when he was working with cadavers. And this one particular cadaver came in, and when you get a fresh cadaver, it says on the sheet that comes with it if they had a frozen shoulder, if they had arthritis, if they had this disease, cancer, whatever. And this particular person, I can't remember exactly what dysfunction it was, but it was something to do with his shoulder. So as he was working with the cadaver and showing his students the anatomy of the cadaver, he noticed when he pulled the shoulder out of the way, the viscera went with it. So he thought that was interesting. So he mobilized the viscera within the cadaver itself, and the shoulder just freed up automatically. So that was kind of a light bulb moment for him. And from that, he worked with his patients and got these amazing results that I guess we kind of see today. But he's the kind of guy that wouldn't just do something once, then put it into a course and make a whole thing out of it. He's the kind of guy that it has to work successfully 200 to 250 times before he introduces it as an actual thing outside his practice.
So there's a growing body of evidence that the visceral manipulation actually is really an effective modality then.
Well, absolutely. There's, if you think of the term viscera, it's derived from the term viscous, which means non-compressible cylinder or entity. And any dysfunction related to visceral compression is likely to result in altered muscular recruitment to minimize compression on the viscera themselves. And this altered recruitment presents itself initially as a functional compensation, as I said before. And as we all know, our bodies are master compensators. And when we experience pain at any level, it's essentially our body saying, well, we can't effectively compensate anymore. And I had a theory, I think it was about 10 years ago now, where I just quietly thought it to myself, what if the hard frame of the body, i.e. muscles and joints, is there to really kind of protect the inside, the soft frame, so the muscle, the organs, the glands, the nerves, the vessels. And if you have a tension in a vessel, for example, the entire body will adopt a posture in order to take pressure off that structure, be it liver, be it lung, be it heart, be it inferior vena cava, the abdominal aorta, etc., etc. So from an evolutionary point of view, it makes sense because the enteric nervous system is the oldest branch of the nervous system because even a single cell has one. And without that, the organism simply can't survive. So I think for many postural adaptations that I see clinically, I would say a solid 80% of them would be from some sort of visceral dysfunction.
Wow. Wow. So this is really fascinating. So, but I can imagine a lot of our viewers thinking, well, okay, so I understand how, like in the frozen shoulder example that you're talking about, that these fascial kind of issues can cause a reduction in mobility. Okay, that makes sense. But visceral manipulation at least claims to be, or explain a lot of deeper issues apart from just mobility. So could you talk about how those kinds of visceral issues might sort of result in deeper challenges?
Okay, so going deeper, if you think about it from a wide lens, so think about it firstly that we are a compilation of everything in the universe, including here on Earth. Each level of the spinal cord is like a kind of like a mini computer station serving through to the server, the brain, um, to control the body, and each nerve root is in charge of everything on its system. Now, the organs have their own nervous system, and if you look at the research with organ transplants, people receiving the organs start having the same visions, feelings, memories, and emotions from the organ donor themselves. Now, going with visceral manipulation, any trauma we go through in our lives, whether it's an infection at the age of 3, kicking our toe at the age of 10, splitting up with our first love at 16, skiing accident at 20, whatever it might be, the body stores that trauma. And wherever our genetic weak links are, that's the first place where the body's going to store the trauma. Now, if you kick your toe, for example, that message can be woken up again. And it sometimes, unfortunately, doesn't matter how healthy you seem to be. These memories that the body stores lay very deep into the system, and they're in the subconscious. So we're not really aware of these weak links that we carry around with us. Now, for example, if you kick your toe one day and you've had a stressful few years, as an example, well, that message can be picked up by the hypogastric plexus in the gut. That hypogastric plexus can then refer onto the small intestine. The small intestine articulates with the stomach. The stomach can then dump the message into the phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve actually is the nerve of the body that stores the memory that we're going to die, or the near-death experience. As we all know, the body thinks in terms of extremes. So if we go through a stressful day, at the physiological level, our body thinks we're going to die. So it takes any measure it can to prevent that. Now, with the phrenic nerve has direct connections into the shoulder capsules. So going on the frozen shoulder example, I have a client who had a lot of anxiety, I think 20, 25 years ago. Now, she's only presented with frozen shoulder in the last 18 months, give or take. And every time I do a treatment on her, I'm drawn to her stomach every single time. And every time I mobilize the stomach, free up the phrenic nerve and the suprascapular nerve coming from C6, the shoulder frees up completely. Now, obviously, the memory of the trauma is still there, so it goes back to what it does. But that's where we can wake up the emotional aspect of what's really going on, causing the dysfunction, and working with that at the level. Now, if you don't have the skills to work with them, say verbally at that emotional level, the body is very, very good at dissipating and healing itself. So all we can do is open up the communication pathways between organ and the brain, so the body can essentially heal itself and unwind itself and figure itself out.
Yeah, so and it's interesting that you're talking about communication there, because that is, in some of the research I was doing, one of the documents that I was reading right from the Burrell Institute was that said straight off that the purpose of visceral manipulation is to recreate, harmonize, and increase proprioceptive communication in the body.
Yeah, so a lot of the time when we have a restriction, I'll use the liver, for example, because that's a nice big organ. The liver is home to anger, it's home to joy, it's home to pessimism, it's home to I can't think of the word, but the people who are a prisoner of their own routine type thing. All these emotions get held literally in the fascia surrounding the organ. So every time we work with the organ, we actually help dissipate that. But when we hold on to the tension in the liver in this example, we can cut off a pathway between body and brain. Now, there's an argument for the atlas here because the atlas is the goalkeeper towards the brain. But for simplicity's sake, for this conversation, when we work with the liver, we wake up the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve connects directly to the brainstem. So anytime we work with an organ, it doesn't have to be physically manipulating the organ. I mean, the liver itself does over 500 things that we currently know of. So it's about that interested in being manipulated. Anytime we detox the liver, anytime we work physically with the liver, so the liver loves extension rotation as an example. Every time we work with these organs, we're actually helping clear the traffic jam, as it were, with the communication in regards to organ and brain. And when these communications get opened up, I've seen amazing things happen.
So in a nutshell, sort of all of these organs are connected to obviously our nervous system in various different ways. And so by working with the viscera that surround and bind them together, you're sort of making those connections function better in some ways, making the communications take place, work better.
Absolutely. I mean, every organ plays its own part in what we'd call the human experience. So each organ functions physically, metabolically, emotionally, and spiritually, if you want to go that far. Now, to give you kind of an analogy, if you think that a TV attracts TV waves and a radio attracts radio waves, well, the stomach will attract waves that are appropriate for the stomach. The liver will attract waves that are appropriate for the liver. But instead of the word waves, we'll use the word consciousness. So each organ has is an antenna for its own correlating, resonating frequency or conscious. The combination of all these experiences is what you and I call human consciousness. It gives us, it descrambles the code given to us from the outside environment, descrambles and gives us into what we can translate into an experience. So every time we're working with an organ, we help change someone's experience. And if someone is pessimistic, for example, just a little bit of help with the liver can just help at least see them. It's like an internal coin toss drill that Paul came up with. And it just helps them see, oh, okay, there is something else here. So, okay, cool. It's not all doom and gloom. We can work with something here.
When you say you work with a client in this modality, what does that entail? What does that, what does that mean?
Working physically, as in manual therapy speaking, that's a word. When you're working with a client with visceral manipulation, you're essentially following the breadcrumb trail that the client gives to you. So when someone presents to you as a human body, they're actually presenting their own physical, mental, emotional, spiritual evolution. And as the therapist, it's very important to be neutral to that and to be respectful to that. Because if you go in too hard, you will literally get pushed away every single time. So you have to go in with the intention to simply help the person. Now, with the breadcrumb trail, when you have a trained eye, it's quite easy to see because the body can't not hug tension. So wherever the greatest tension is at the time, your entire body will hug that tension. So if you had your appendix out when you were 6, as an example, your entire body will form around that scar and to protect that area of the body. So what I do is I go into what's called a listening technique, where placing my hands on the patient's head, and that will give me a line of tension through the body, and it can be anywhere in the body. If you come in with a sore lower back, I might get taken to your toe. I can get taken to your right shoulder, to your eyes. It can go anywhere. So I don't really pay much attention, respectfully, to the client when they come in saying, I have a sore knee. So I can get taken to their liver. I can get taken to their sternum. It's different for everyone. And the beauty of it is you never know what you're going to do until the person is physically in front of you. And so from the initial meeting, I find the greatest tension at the time. With that greatest tension point, there's usually 2 or 3 other points that it extends to. Now, they might have 10 different tension spots in their body, but I'm finding as I work with this more and more, less is more. And the less I do, the more powerful it becomes. Because when I first started, I wanted to release every tension that every single person had and be the hero and whatnot. But what I'm realizing from that was a lot of people went home extremely tired. They went into a detox mode where they couldn't get out of bed for 2 days. Some people even brought on more depression before it got better. So people got worse before they got better. Unfortunately, when they got better, it didn't really relate back to what I did. So, yeah, that was a hard one for the ego, but we're all here to learn, right? So, but with that, I release the greatest tension at the time, and then whatever that connects to and whatever that connects to, I try and keep it to 5 real simple things. And I find that's usually enough to drop the pebble in the pond, and it has more of a global effect. And working with the liver, working with the olfactory nerve, the mesentery root of the small intestine, those have massively global effects on the body. So to answer the question, what I really do is to simply find the greatest tension at the time, release that. There might be several others, and I just follow the breadcrumb trail to it. And most of the time, there are exceptions, of course, but most of the time it does. You can usually halve someone's pain. So if someone comes in 8 out of 10 knee pain, mobilizing the kidney, the cecum, sigmoid colon, liver, whatever it might be, even the thoracic aorta. I had someone yesterday, their knee pain just disappeared. And sometimes I scratch my head and think, well, I don't know how that works. But that's when you get out the anatomy book and see what's connected to what.
Wow, that's the I'm probably gonna do this backwards, but what brought you to visceral manipulation? How did you come to find it?
Well, I guess it was the main inspiration was the totem pole. And obviously I've been studying Paul's work for many, many years now. And I've always been interested in what controls what in the body. So every time a client would shift during a squat, every time their knee would go in, every time their back would hurt, even when they had perfect posture doing a deadlift, for an example, I always tried to work things out. So when I stumbled upon Paul's totem pole, I thought I hit the jackpot, and it ironed out a lot of client stuff. And then I didn't know visceral manipulation was a thing until I saw it kind of advertised. I think it was randomly on Google one time. Thought, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know you could really physically do it. So as I was studying the levels through the CHEK Institute, nobody really touched on the viscera. And I found working with the viscera, it is a massively two-way street. So the viscera communicates with the outside communicates with the inside. But I found the pathway between viscera to periphery is kind of like a double-lane highway. And the pathway from periphery to viscera is more like a goat trail, if you understand that analogy. So my underlying purpose for learning this was just to simply help people. And for me, no one else is doing it. And it's not it's not an ego thing. It's more of a, well, what has this person not tried? They've seen chiropractors, doctors, physiotherapists, etc. Nothing's really working. It's helping short term, but not long term. So what can we do to get this person long term ironed out, essentially? So when I did level 1 of the visceral course, I was just blown away with how much the viscera actually affects the musculoskeletal system. And I remember my first client, the morning after the course finished, I think this person had, if I remember, they had a restricted first rib and something going on with the shoulder. I can't quite remember. And So I did my thing, and I usually start sessions with a 10 to 15 minute treatment to iron them out, and then we go into the training or the coaching or whatever it might be. And from there, I mobilized her left kidney, and her shoulder and neck just freed up completely. And that was one example. But then my next client, who had a dog who was about 1,600 years old, came up these stairs riddled with arthritis. My client went to the change rooms to get ready for our session. And I was just patting the dog, kind of feeling under its tummy, and I thought, okay, well, there's the ribs. Oh, that's where the liver must be. And so I just sort of started playing. I mobilized the dog's liver, and it was like a puppy for the rest of the session. It was jumping around, running around. That, for me, was the first light bulb moment. That was when the learning became the verb. And it was like, yeah, there's something here. We need to follow this.
Yeah. Well, and that was going to be my sort of follow-up question is, so for you, what was the biggest lesson that you've learned about either what it means to be human or what is human health, what it means to be healthy?
I think the biggest lesson is that it's so layered. It's we're not just muscles and bones. Most therapists and trainers concentrate on the outside of the body, but when we get into the insides of the body, there is so much more going on that we know of consciously. But not only the effects on the viscera themselves, but the viscera's connection to the psyche. And we all know what kind of a role the psyche plays. It's kind of a big deal, right? So the effect on that has a profound effect on the psyche and vice versa. And I remember Paul saying 100 years ago, when the viscera weren't important, he was saying one of the best ways to screw up the viscera is stinking thinking. And I see that every day. And when you work with the organ itself, you can see the effect that it has on the person, because you see something just different in their eyes. You can see a light switch on for the first time. And to see that in someone who's been more or less dead for a lot of their life, it's quite an amazing experience. And you see tears, you see people shaking, you see people who are just lost for words, because they're actually feeling something from the inside for the first time. And it's like they are themselves, and they're not a combination of what they perceive other people think they are. So to answer the question, it's the layers, and I feel personally that when we get beyond the outside of the body, when we can go inside and work with people at the level that people need to be worked at, then we're going to make a real difference in people's health.
Well, I mean, this is so much. I was super intrigued when when we talked about doing this, because I was one of those people who thought, yeah, well, the viscera is just the stuff that holds your organs in place. Uh, and it's amazing how much deeper just connected tissue really is.
Yeah, it's I mean, as Matthew Walden put in his one of his papers, we are infinitely more complex than a car.
Yeah.
That's the understatement of the century. And even Jean-Pierre Barral, who's been an osteopath for, I think, 46 years now or something, and he's been studying this particular technique for over 30. Even he's blown away with how much we don't know yet, and we're just still scratching the surface. Just anatomy-wise, we're still scratching the surface.
Well, I really appreciate this introduction to visceral manipulation. This has been fantastic. And Matt, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, either to learn more about how to use visceral manipulation in their practice, or perhaps to work with you as a client, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, I currently am working on a website, having technical difficulties, as everyone does. The best way to get in contact with me would be via Instagram, Matt Sorenson HH at Instagram. I will be holding a mentorship coming soon, after I teach exercise coach in August, and I will be bringing out a course on how to work with the viscera either later this year or early next year.
Oh, that's really exciting. Well, thanks again, Matt. I'd love to talk to you another time. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper into some of these specific topics. I really find the connection between the viscera and emotions really fascinating. But that seems like a whole kettle of fish for another episode.
Yeah, we could do that, definitely.
Great, good. Well, thanks again, Matt, and thanks to everybody for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you all on the CHEK blog again.
Thanks, James.